Good afternoon and welcome to A Renewed Republic. I am your host, Rocky Pedin, and today we are going to be talking about paradoxes, and specifically we're going to talk about the paradox of democracy. But first, if you like this content and you want to hear more of it or see more of it, please consider hitting the like and the subscribe button. Also consider sharing with family and friends. The whole purpose of this podcast, or whatever this is called, is to get more people involved and have those conversations and get those rolling. So if you want to help to that cause, please do so. Okay, before we get into the paradox of democracy, let's talk about paradoxes in general. And the best definition that I have found that resonates the most with me is a situation, person, or thing that combines contradictory features or qualities. How would then we define the paradox of democracy? And the idea is that in a democratic society, you have the opportunity for people to come into power who then they themselves do not agree with democracy and can turn that society into either a theocracy or authoritarian regime or a fascist regime or whatever the case may be. And you might be thinking, oh, Rocky, you're going to start talking about Donald Trump. And you're right, I am going to eventually talk about Donald Trump, but the first person I'm actually going to talk about is Adolf Hitler, because Adolf Hitler came into power through these types of means. And when you think about that part of history in Germany, post-World War I, pre-World War II, that period of time, a lot happens. And so we're going to do a little brief history lesson here. And I'm being generous when I say brief, because we're going to keep it real short. There's a lot more that happens than what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is going to be an oversimplification, but there is tons of content about the Weimar Republic in Germany post-World War I and how that contributed to the rise of Hitler. We're just going to identify a couple things to prove the point here about how the idea of the paradox of democracy can actually play out in the real world, because it did here. So if you're not familiar with the Republic, that was the democracy that was put into place post-World War I. It had generally broad freedoms, and it also had proportional representation, which is something that we should identify. Most governments in Europe, I shouldn't say most, I can't confirm that. I know a lot of governments in Europe have proportional representation, which all that means is that, take the United States, for example, we have Democrats and we have Republicans. We also have these other fringe parties, right? We have the Green Party, we have the Libertarian Party, we have the Progressive Party, we have like other parties, but they almost always will caucus with either the Democrats or the Republicans. Bernie Sanders is a great example. He's an independent technically, but he caucuses with the Democrats almost always. In other countries, they would have representation for those other parties, the Green Party, but also potentially like not just progressive left parties, but super far right parties, like the Nazi Party, for example. And that's what the Weimar Republic has. And bear in mind, at this point in time in Germany, like World War I not only devastated Germany, but also like the Treaty of Versailles was in particular crushing on the German economy. So what does this allow? Well, anytime any society goes through this period, this type of thing where economics are bad, the people are concerned, they're worried, there's a lot of strife, in general, things don't feel good, it's not uncommon for those people then to turn to a strongman figure. In this case, it's Adolf Hitler. So the Nazis, to a certain degree, exploit this crisis. And by 1932, they become the largest party in the Reichstag. And they do this all through legal actions. They don't do anything illegal at this point, right? This is all like them getting into power. They don't break any rules, nothing major anyways, and they become the largest party in the Reichstag. In 1933, Hitler is appointed chancellor through constitutional means. Within weeks, they utilized the Reichstag fire, which is a false flag operations that the Nazis do on themselves. They use it as pretext to suspend civil liberties under what's known as the Reichstag Fire Decree, and that's passed by President Hindenburg. There's other things that are happening at the same time with the browncoats and the Nazis showing up in places specifically to disturb the peace, trying to incite violence as a pretext to crack down even harder in those areas with more troops. And if that sounds familiar, I'm glad it does, because something similar is happening today. We'll get to that in a minute. So after the Reichstag Fire Decree passed, almost immediately thereafter, the Enabling Act of March 1933, legally transfers the legislative power to Hitler's cabinet. And that essentially ends democracy from within the system. And famously, there was conservatives in Germany at the time who said, look, we've hired Hitler. That's what they said. And those guys were idiots, and most of them died because Hitler was not to be hired. Hitler was on a path, on a mission, and he did everything legally. I should put a caveat there, mostly legally. I'm sure there are things that he did that weren't legal. Like obviously the Reichstag fire itself as a false flag is not a legal thing. But what I'm trying to get at is that he used the system that was available to him, and he pulled the levers in such a way as to make the thing that it was intended to be a democracy no longer a democracy. And that's, again, where we get the paradox coming into play. So how is this similar to what's happening today in the United States? Let's dig into this real quick. And I don't want to spend too much time on this because I don't want this video to be an hour long, but there's a lot of things happening right now. And we talked a little bit about this when we were going over the video about the meeting in Quantico. And I want to recall a couple things that were talked about in that meeting. So first, Secretary Hegseth talked about the rules of engagement changing. He talked about that. And I want to be very clear about this. That is a bad thing. Those rules of engagement are in place so that our troops do not commit war crimes, whether against other American citizens or actual enemies. It doesn't matter. Like, that should not change. And then more importantly, I would say, is how President Trump has been framing political opposition, how he's been talking about Democrats, the enemy from within, and an invasion, right? He's been using those words to describe Democrats. And not only is he doing that to his base of MAGA supporters, he is also doing this to the military, right? So he's in the room with the admirals and the generals, and he is telling them the Democrats are the enemy. And I don't necessarily think that they were looking for a loyalty pledge on that particular day, but what I do think they were doing is they were gauging the responses of the admirals and generals. I'd be very curious if there was any AI technology deployed in that meeting that was grading and judging faces in the audience and looking for facial expressions in response to the speech. And I can think of, like, that is the only reason why I can imagine why they wanted to have those admirals and generals live in person for that speech. Because as I said in my last video, there was no good reason to fly all of those men and women to that location. The security risk of having all of our admirals and generals and the president and the Secretary of War in one room. Granted, I know it's Quantico. Quantico is a safe place, but still, it's still a security risk. It's layer in the other things that are happening right now, as well as that have happened over this first, well, we're only 9 months into this presidency, into this term. It feels like we're already like 3 or 4 years into this thing, but we're not. So we're in 9 months. What other things has President Trump himself done, or his cabinet, his party, his administration? And it starts with the courts. So they've undermined judicial authority. They've attacked judges in courts. Just over the weekend, Stephen Miller was referring to a liberal, actually, I don't even think she was a liberal judge. I think she was put in place by President Trump in his past term. I could be wrong about that. But either way, he characterized this person as a liberal judge and also as a terrorist. And essentially is characterizing all liberal judges as terrorists. The next day, her house explodes and burns to the ground. Could it be a coincidence? Sure, maybe, I guess, but probably not. And that's something that this administration has done consistently. When they were talking about deporting people and judges put stays on those orders, they ignored them. They said, well, how are you going to enforce this, right? So when we think about the separation of powers inside the United States government, this is one of the things that the founders feared, is a continued collection of power in the executive branch, because that would start to form a position more akin to a king than to a president. And the framers in particular were very cautious of this. They were very worried about it. Rightfully so, as we're learning. The other thing that President Trump has been doing is politicizing or weaponizing law enforcement and the DOJ. Thinking about the DOJ, they just brought charges, but in the last couple of weeks, they brought charges against James Comey. President Trump has a history of saying that he's a vindictive person. He's on camera being recorded as saying that in the 90s. And like, that's certainly playing out to be true in this instance as well. They fired oversight figures, and we think about like the Department of Government Efficiency, DOGE, that Elon Musk headed up. And if you recall, I remember them talking about like the what's that title? The inspectors general. And there's like tons of inspectors general inside the government, or at least there used to be. And everybody was like, well, what do they do? And like, what they did was they were a nonpartisan arbiter of truth. And I'm not going to sit and say that like it was perfect, because I think the federal government in the United States fundamentally has some flaws associated with secrecy and corruption. But that was their job, to be the people who held truth or made determinations on truth. And so without those people, it's hard to say what is the truth and what isn't. And we're seeing this right now play out with some of the things that RFK says, for example, RFK Jr. Some of the things that he says are just flat out lies, just straight up lies. And what has this administration done? They have essentially gotten rid of people who question the administration. They've purged those people. We've purged high-ranking military officials. When Trump and Secretary Hegseth came into power, 2 of the Joint Chiefs of Staff were let go, one of which was a black man and one of which was a woman. I'm sure that's just a coincidence too. Okay, what else have they done? Attacks on election integrity. They've been talking about how 2020 was stolen since it happened, with no evidence, and all those cases being thrown out of the various courts. They continue to perpetuate the big lie. And again, what does that do? Not only does it undermine confidence in our system, but it riles people up. It makes them feel like they've been cheated. And when you're layering in like, oh, I've been cheated by the enemy, the Democrats, who are Antifa, which is a terrorist organization, all of a sudden you're building this case, this example of why it's okay to kill them, or why it's okay to lock them in cages, or why it's okay to prohibit them from voting. You start building the pretense to be able to do all those things, quote unquote, legally. What else? I mean, but before that meeting in Quantico, Trump was on camera telling people, yeah, I might fire people on the spot if I don't like what they have to say, or if they do something I don't agree with. And like, that is, in and of itself, that may not seem like a lot, but when you start adding that to other things that he's done, it gets to be a very serious situation. We also have attacks on civil society, the media, and information control. I mean, Trump has been talking about fake news for a long time. He clearly has favorites in the news organizations, and maybe all presidents do. And here's the thing about this. I kind of agree with President Trump about the media. The media is a cesspool. You know, whether you're talking CNN or MSNBC or Fox or OAN or any of them, really. Any of the corporate media is a cesspool. And I say that because they are all owned by mega rich people. Billionaires own CNN, same thing with Fox. And so it's within their best interest to not share all the information, right? Like, it's in their best interest. And that's why I go to independent media sources. And there's a few other media sources that I trust, like NPR, I trust for the most part. But like The Atlantic, I trust. And then like independent individuals. So Glenn Greenwald, Breaking Points, Kyle Kalinske. I mean, shoot, I'll even go listen to Tucker Carlson before I listen to CNN. And call me crazy, but like there's some things that Tucker Carlson says lately that I'm just like, yeah, it makes a whole bunch of sense. I don't know if you heard him talking about affordability and housing, but yeah, like spot on. I agree 1000% with what he was saying. Okay. And then the last thing is, that Trump has been using his emergency powers, quote unquote, claiming that he's going to use the Insurrection Act to federalize the National Guard. Like, these are dangerous things. Like, we have the National Guard of Texas being flown into other states. So not only is the federal government trampling on states' rights when the governors and the mayors of those states and those cities are saying, we don't want you here. Now we have other states sending their troops. Like, do you understand how this leads to a civil war? Talk about the guts from the Oregon general of the National Guard. And I don't know his name. I'm going to do a video on him separately. But that dude stood up and said, hey, if we get mobilized, we're going to do one thing, and that's protect the citizens, because that's our job. But not all of the generals think that way. Some of the generals are bootlickers. The governors are bootlickers. Looking at you, Greg Abbott. These are the blocks that you lay down on the path to pave our way to fascism. It's not hyperbole, okay? What's happening in Chicago right now, what's happening in Portland, this is the path towards fascism. No ifs, ands, or buts about it. So what do we do about this? Like, how do we move forward? Well, the first thing we got to do is be vocal and be pissed off about this. Understand what's happening. Like, read the actual Constitution and the articles at play here. And then get out in the street and start protesting. Do it legally. Be loud. Don't engage in, throwing bricks or water bottles or anything like that. You don't want to give them the pretense and the pretext that they're looking for to ratchet up and impose curfews and like start doing like some serious violent stuff. Like, there is already violence happening. That priest got shot in the head with the pepper ball. That was one thing. It's happening in Portland. It's happening in Chicago. The kids in Chicago being ripped out of their apartment building and zip tied on the street. Like, look, guys, like, that's not like some fantasy world. That's happening. That's happening right now. And if you're not furious about that, I don't know what to tell you. In particular, you fucking slack-jawed, flag-waving, don't tread on me motherfuckers. If you're not out there protesting right now, and you're raised up F-250 with the fucking blackout diesel bullshit cloud, and your giant American flag and don't tread on me flag, if you're not out protesting right now, you may as well take that flag and the American flag and torch that motherfucker, because you don't believe in what those things stand for. That's the truth. If you're not out there protesting this, then all you are is a bootlicker to this administration. That's just what it boils down to. All right. I'm going to regain my composure a little bit here. Let's talk about what we need to make sure we have moving forward. And it's really just understanding our responsibility as American citizens. We have the framework of the separation of powers and the checks and balances. But what it requires is that Americans understand that framework and that they're actively engaged in that framework as well. Understanding what independent institutions should be overseeing the federal government, what are the democratic norms that are in play and also at risk right now. And frankly, I can't tell you how frustrating it is as an American citizen to have somebody like Pam Bondi pulled up and testify in front of Congress and tell them she is not going to answer their questions. That needs to stop. If you work for the federal government, you work for all of us. And you need to be able to answer those questions. Unless there's like some legitimate security risk, but that needs to be agreed to by some committee or something. I don't know. That is absurd. We need to understand the constitutional limits that the president has. He does not have unchecked power. And I don't know if you saw this from Stephen Miller the other day when he started talking about plenary power. And I think I'm pronouncing that right. And he was being interviewed by CNN, and he was talking about the president having plenary power, and he's referring to the National Guard, and then he just froze. And the video is chilling because it's very clearly that there isn't a technical issue going on. His eyes are blinking, but his mouth is not moving. He is not talking. And it's like, oh shit, I just kind of spilled the beans. And like, kind of shame on the CNN guy for giving him the out of like, oh, we must be having technical difficulties. It's like, no, you're not. You need to drill into that. Because what he said is dangerous thinking. Very, very dangerous. So look, we're going to end the video at this. Democracy as we know it. And don't give me that line about we don't live in a democracy, we live in a constitutional republic. Like, if that's your line, go read a book, go engage in what the framers talked about. I don't want to hear it. We are on the path of chipping away our civil rights and liberties. And if we don't stand up loudly and vocally and tell this administration that we're not going to put up with it, then we are going to lose everything, potentially. Do not let that happen. We have a responsibility an obligation to our kids to not let that happen. See you guys in the next one.